This would be huge. I think that actually would be one of the biggest moves that could be made from the federal government. It sends a huge message to the international concerns, including BRICS, what's happening within BRICS in terms of what they're doing strategically to realign against the dollar. We are eerily nearing that very same cycle that occurs again, and that is when these massive shifts take place.
Donald Trump made an important speech at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville over the weekend. He said he would make several important changes if he were president, including implementing a strategic Bitcoin reserve and firing Gary Gensler. What does this mean for the Bitcoin price, the market, and just overall adoption? We'll talk about this and the recent tech sell-off with our next guest, Paul Barron, CEO of Paul Barron Network. If you haven't checked out the Paul Barron Network, links down below. It's a great channel. Check it out. This episode is brought to you by iTrust Capital, an IRA that offers 35 crypto assets and the lowest trading fees in the crypto IRA space at 1%. And it offers unique tax benefits. So if you'd like to learn more, click on itrust.capital/David. Click on the link down below or scan the QR code here to learn more and get started. And if you sign up using my referral link, you can get $100 in signing bonuses. Paul, welcome back to the show. Always good to see you.
Nice to see you, David. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Very good. How are you?
Excellent. Things have been good. A little bit crazy in the markets, but hey, this is to be expected.
You know, Bitcoin's down today. We're going to talk about that because Trump just made possibly the most bullish speech ever for Bitcoin over the weekend of the Bitcoin conference. We'll talk about that. But first, let's talk about the broad sell-off in tech that we saw over the course of the last 2 weeks or so. The biggest rotation out of tech since 2022. What's been going on?
Well, I mean, we've been tracking a lot of what's been happening around innovative tech for quite some time. Obviously, we look at some of the characteristics of how these stocks start to move. Mainly, what I'm looking for is mainstream, not necessarily adoption, but at least people understanding what's happening. NVIDIA is a good example. I think with their partnerships and some of the things they've been able to release in terms of their product enhancements, definitely on the rise, but I'm still concerned a little bit about AI in general. Not in necessarily, I think everybody's, theoretically concerned, but when you look at how far NVIDIA can go, along with a lot of the other correlated stocks, including Meta, you look at Apple, Microsoft, with obviously some of the things that they've dealt with in terms of challenges. But I think, is this a top? If you listen to Tom Lee or some of the analysts on Wall Street, they're still pointing that this has a real potential in the last half of the year. I'm a little bit more bearish in the sense that we're watching some, what I think are kind of unique characteristics of investors, both on the Mag 5, Mag 7, and also crypto, because there is a sector in crypto that is highly correlated to what's happening really on Wall Street. Primarily, I look at decentralized compute. You look at things like DeepIn, a handful of companies and projects like Render Network, which is designed to really kind of decentralize rendering technology from a graphic standpoint. And they're highly connected to NVIDIA. First thing that we've started to see here recently is declining addresses on the Render Network. That tells me, is the investment market fatiguing, or is it just that they're looking at diversifying their portfolio, looking elsewhere, which is, I think, is what is happening.
As a technologist, maybe you can explain this to us. What people are wondering is whether or not NVIDIA can maintain the lead in the GPUs sector, or do you think other competitors will start catching up and eventually erode its market share and ultimately its value?
I don't know. You look at NVIDIA and just their strategy from the chip side of things. There's a handful of companies out there that have started to already kind of move in this direction. Whether or not they can hold this lead at the pace in which they've been innovating I think is the real question mark. The demand, yes, it's clearly there right now. You could look at this two ways. One way, of course, there's many analysts look at this and say, hey, look at the way that the internet was built. If you go back and look at Oracle, Cisco, all the different companies that were involved in the creation of the internet, it was really used in the startup phase. AI, I feel like, is a bit different in the sense that we are so early stage right now. The real question, I think, for AI is we don't really know what the compute, number one, the compute power requirements are going to be, and number two, some of the applications that eventually are going to be rolled out. Because I think we're seeing a lot of challenges right now, just in the way that AI learning is done. So I'm still putting NVIDIA as a buy for us, but we're very cautious right now just because of the competition and the use case as well as the product market fit.
And valuations wise, where do you stand on this debate? Overvalued, undervalued, fairly valued?
I think right now, today, it's fairly valued only because of the position that they hold in the marketplace. And what I mean by that is they're technically the kingpin. Until we see real competition starting to move in, especially on the chip side, then I think then you could probably step back and maybe look at some alternatives. The same thing happened if you look at where Microsoft was and Apple in their early days, and they became arch enemies. I worked for Microsoft, and Apple, though they were much smaller, was still a very serious threat. I think NVIDIA could be facing maybe a similar scenario in the next 18 to 36 months.
Here's a theory. I'm just speculating here, right? Apple just partnered with OpenAI to incorporate OpenAI's technology in their latest iOS. Could Apple start making really advanced chips that could start competing with NVIDIA in the AI domain? Apple started making their own M chips, right? They just deviated from Intel. They just said, screw it, we're making our own chips.
No, the silicon is solid. If you look at Apple's movements and its comparison against really, I think, some of the best chip makers out there, whether you look at AMD or Intel, the scenario, I think, for Apple is the mindset around AI. And the fact that they are partnering with key, players within the industry, they're going to understand the load requirement and some of the things that really are kind of nuanced. NVIDIA is a bit different because they've been able to kind of build their whole business on the gaming sector. So they understand the requirements there. Apple has never been in high compute scale before because they're not a gaming company. And I think that's the real difference between Apple and NVIDIA is NVIDIA probably is more prepared for the amount of compute that is going to be required for AI. Could Apple speed up and get there? Sure. Anybody with that many billions of dollars in research can catch you. That's the whole point.
No, I asked this question to a fund manager. I want to get your take. Intel has lagged, not just lagged NVIDIA this year and the other chip makers, but it's like grossly underperformed the S&P index. It's gone down like 30% year to date or something. Is that, when you look at that in isolation, do you think, okay, that's just company error, or do you think it's just really, really undervalued and it's a good buy? What's your take there?
I still like Intel because I think, combine that with the GPU market and what the opportunities are there, I think there's still a lot of effort going there. And the other thing that I'm a bit concerned with Apple, even though the silicon architecture is really designed well in the essence, and I use all Macs, but in the same time in our studio, we use almost all PCs. So that's a good example. We're doing research and we're doing general compute power, we're using Macs, but when we need real heated, beefy, rendering capability, it falls usually on a PC. So I think Intel still wins that day. Now the chip side of it, that's a different game. And again, I think, obviously with the just the GPU power of what NVIDIA is doing. So I think paired with what they're doing versus Apple, who is trying to take it all in one fatal swoop. How do they deal with the graphics cards as well as the compute power on their silicon architecture? That's still, I think, a game that has not been fully played out yet. They're still making some great some great computers, but it's still a question mark in my opinion.
That's a great point. How do you think processors are going to have to adjust to just exponentially greater GPU processing speeds from Intel and NVIDIA and other chip makers?
No doubt I think we're close to seeing a whole new crop of chips coming. And I think the question is really whether or not we see this coming out of China or if we see this coming here in the United States. Granted, I understand the strategy with what Apple has done with their silicon, but if you look at the M1 and the M2, and even if you go to the M2 Pro and the M2 Max, and you look at the benchmark test, because we've just done these internally, I'm still a bit concerned as to what their real viability is when we see next level compute required. And that's the point. We're getting at speeds in terms of advancements where next level compute is going to be a big deal. All that being said, the decentralized opportunity that's out there right now for decentralized compute could change the game. I think that's still up in the air as to whether or not that happens. Like I mentioned earlier with Render, and what they've been able to do on decentralized rendering capabilities around graphic development, movies, a lot of these heavy load processes that are going to be needed. So listen, it is a very fun and exciting time in technology right now. That's for sure.
So basically, you think CPU is eventually going to have to catch up with GPU? Is your take?
Will do. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's move on to Bitcoin now and cryptos. So exciting news. The biggest news over the weekend is Donald Trump's speech. Let's go over, first of all, his speech and then subsequent market reaction. So keep highlights from his speech. First, he wants to fire Gary Gensler. He said,
right, they're going to keep their hands off crypto. They're going to let it grow. We're going to let it grow. On day one, I will fire Gary Gensler and appoint a new SEC chairman. I didn't know he was that unpopular.
What's your reaction to this? Well, the crowd reaction was thunderous. Big applause there. I don't even know if legally the president is allowed to fire the SEC chair. Right?
I think we've had several legal analysts on with us before. It's really kind of goes out to his the end of his actual not contract, but his term. And typically, what happens is that when an administration shifts, typically, you'll see, especially if it's a Democratic or versus Republican bureaucrat there, they'll typically step down. It's just usually a step down position. Now, you could put a lot of pressure on him, sure. Of course you could. But I think he's, it's a bit theatrical whether or not he pulled the plug on Gensler. I think Gensler would probably leave before Trump even would be in a position to put pressure on him.
Do we have any speculation or idea as to who he's going to replace Gary Gensler with?
I think Hester Pierce is probably, right now at least, the I would say the candidate that would be pro blockchain. She's been on record quite a bit, and also she's been doing a bit of a podcast tour here recently and getting a little bit more outspoken with her positions. And if you look at Commissioner Ueda, who I think is the other one that also is very pro blockchain. It's a good split down the middle. I still don't think this. I know everybody will probably go, "You're crazy, Paul," but I still don't think that Gensler is anti-crypto. I still think he secretly is a crypto. He's obviously he has to make a lot of changes and decisions, but some of the I think just the aggressiveness has been the one that has been concerned the industry so much in terms of their their legal actions.
So you think Gary Gensler could potentially change his tune if he has a new boss, basically? I think
first of all, you need Congress to act, and I think you get through some of the congressional movements right now. You go to the FIT 21 bill. I like that. When we see that come into place, I think this will change the tune of Gensler. You got to remember, Gensler still, it wasn't him personally, but this still happened on his watch, and that is an Ethereum ETF. That you have to kind of step back, because I think a lot of people, including many of the best analysts out there, if you look at Bloomberg guys, Jeff and the guys over there, I don't think anybody expected this, this early. Sure, maybe down the line, but here we are, mid 2024, and we have an ETH ETF trading today. And that, to me, is still a very bullish movement for blockchain as a whole in the industry.
We'll talk about ETH in just a minute and the Bitcoin price. Okay, moving on to the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve.
So, as the final part of my plan today, I am announcing that if I am elected, it will be the policy of my administration, United States of America, to keep 100% of all the Bitcoin the U.S. government currently holds or acquires into the future. We'll keep 100%. I hope you do well, please. This will serve in effect as the core of the strategic national Bitcoin stockpile. As you know,
Arguably the biggest piece of news that he announced. It was widely already kind of rumored that he would make this announcement, but he just kind of affirmed people's rumors. Okay, what does this mean ultimately for Bitcoin adoption?
This would be huge. I think that actually would be one of the biggest moves that could be made from the federal government. First of all, I think it would, one, normalize and also mainstream what's happening in crypto. Bitcoin obviously being the biggest, 800-pound gorilla. But I think the other thing is it sends a huge message to the international concerns, including BRICS, what's happening within BRICS in terms of what they're doing strategically to realign against the dollar. And I think it also sends a tremendous amount of message to the Pacific Rim, because that's essentially where we're losing all of the innovative technology, including developers, a lot of startup entrepreneurs, et cetera, mainly that are just starting businesses outside of the United States because of the problem. So I think the fact that we could get a federal government, one, behind crypto, especially behind Bitcoin, and start understanding that blockchain and all of its related projects that are out there, whether that's Solana, Ethereum, Avalanche, many of the projects that are out there that are, I would say, are very well respected, that start moving their way into mainstream financial instruments. This will be a big move. And it may be the one thing that could save the United States in terms of its debt situation if we really started getting serious about a strategic reserve.
Well, that's kind of a big statement that you just made. Let's talk about that. The U.S. debt situation. Well, walk us through, first of all, before we get into the Bitcoin part, what is wrong, in your opinion, with the U.S. debt situation? So obviously, as you know, 128% above debt to GDP ratio. You got $1.1 trillion in interest payments alone on federal debt. The broader issue then is what?
I mean, David, you know the math here. This math does not compute. There's no way out of this. It's impossible. I think the only way out of that is going to be an appreciating asset of some sort. And if you do see a Bitcoin renaissance, so to speak, or an emergence on the open market, remember, Bitcoin has not really completely retraced its all-time high back to where we've been in this market that we're in today. And it's struggled to really kind of accelerate beyond that, regardless of all the positive news. Now, granted, we came up from around 35,000 up to around 70K. Sure, that's a great run for 2024. A lot of people have been looking for other alternatives. You look at some of the estimations by many of the analysts, I mean, they're picking everything between, and I've seen numbers from $1 million Bitcoin to $3 million Bitcoin. I think the point is that once that the federal government gets behind this, they should be one of the largest holders of this. And if it does go to the number that we're thinking it will do, then it does position, I think, the United States maybe in the future to look at Bitcoin as a true reserve asset. And I think that's something to keep your eye on.
Once Bitcoin becomes a reserve asset, how would that solve the debt problem?
Well, I think it's just an investment architecture. You're looking at the amount of growth opportunity. If you could capitalize federal systems, government applications, even go down to the level of operational sides of things in government, and you're utilizing a strategic reserve that's accelerating at anywhere between 20% a year to as much as 60% a year, it takes things quite a bit differently. The other thing that you have to think about is just the bell curve in terms of adoption. We're still at a very, very early entry point, I think, for crypto and blockchain in general. And it doesn't mean Bitcoin would be the only asset that I think, because once that I think a federal government starts to understand this technology and how it's moving so quickly, then the opportunity is to extend that reserve into alternative assets, diversify. And you could see things like ETH, Solana, who knows what we would see in terms of a potential opportunity there for a government to get in it. I mean, you look at El Salvador, you look at some of the emerging countries that have been able to do it somewhat successfully, and they look like geniuses now. When you look at the comparison of where they were 2 years ago as to where they are right now, those are the kind of opportunities I think that represent a pretty big deal. The other thing is it does fend off the issue, I think, that is our biggest threat of all, and that's BRICS. And that's crazy to say, but BRICS is organized right now They are in a position where they are going to de-dollarize, and that will have an impact on the U.S., no doubt.
Here's a concern I don't see brought up a lot. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was used to arguably change or quote unquote manipulate the oil price. In 2022, Biden released a huge amount, I think 180 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. During that year, the oil price went down. It's been speculated this release was part of the reason of the decline of the oil price. I'm just saying, Paul, it's possible the U.S. may use this reserve to quote unquote manipulate the price, sell it, and then buy it back at a lower price. That's exactly what they did with oil in 2022.
No doubt. I mean, there are things that can be manipulated like that. Could that occur in terms of when the market could grow? I think the key here right now would be how would they get access to it? Now, granted, they are still one of the largest holders of Bitcoin today. So if they chose to dump on the market, much like what we've seen with Germany, with what we've seen with Mt. Gox, but even with Mt. Gox in Germany coming at the market, and I'm not a huge Bitcoiner. You know, I look at all the other assets. I think other assets have, better opportunities to turn upside. But if you look at that market and the adjustment that Bitcoin has made and then recovered again, it is just one of those assets that's so resilient. And the other thing too is, as we see, and it goes back to your point, if the U.S. were to try to manipulate something like this in the way that the oil reserves were manipulated, I think it leaves too much of an opening that becomes national security as a threat for BRICS. And I keep going back to that, but BRICS understands one simple thing: de-dollarize. And if we get in a position where Bitcoin could be an out, or any digital asset could be an out, or at least assist, I think the United States has to consider that as a strategy that is real going forward. So it's a big deal.
The concern I've heard a couple of years ago is the government using some sort of currency they can't track or control. Bitcoin, as you know, is a decentralized asset, not controlled by any one entity. The government
is fully
not
traceable.
Yes, but they can't control it like they can possibly with a CBDC, right? So this is the concern that people have brought up to me in the past: is why would the government want to challenge themselves?
So,
why would the government create any incentive for people to use anything besides fiat or a CBDC, which is just digital fiat, right?
Yeah, I think for sure. You're dealing with, especially with a CBDC position, as a major challenge for what could be the future. However, if a central bank digital currency was backed by a reserve asset, whether it's gold, Bitcoin, something else commodity driven, if you look at the petrodollar, essentially, when you think about BRICS, I think BRICS I go back to BRICS a lot. Their architecture they're trying to build is a true reserve model. And I think that's really where the United States is going to end up. If you go back pre-Bretton Woods, that was where we started. Now, can it be one that we can break because of our current situation, from a fiscal position, on our debt? Listen, that's way above my pay grade. It's going to take some brilliant people in the federal government to pull that off. I know that I said
right.
Brilliant people in the federal government is oxymoron, but that's what it's going to take.
Well, I'm sure there are some brilliant people in the federal government, Paul. Okay, so by the way, Trump did say on the campaign trail, not just last weekend, but he said on the campaign trail he would not allow a CBDC to happen if he were president. So I guess that concern is no longer relevant if he were president. Suppose he follows through with that. But let's say there's a Bitcoin strategic reserve, and let's say that people, not just the government, start using Bitcoin as more of a medium of exchange. Now, at one point, let's suppose hypothetically the Bitcoin as a medium of exchange starts dominating exchange, peer-to-peer exchange, and perhaps challenging the U.S. dollar. At this point, the government is going to look like, the dollar is going to look weaker from an medium of exchange perspective. What would the government do in that situation?
I think you have to look at this in a cycle. I don't know if you've ever read the book, The Fourth Turning. And
Neil
if you
Howe.
look at, so if you look at the cycles that we're faced with here in modern day society, we are eerily nearing that very same cycle that occurs again, and that is when these massive shifts take place. And I think right now, all the particular tells that we're dealing with on a global standpoint as well as here within the United States, this gets into a position where it may not be a choice. And I think that's the key here. If you have a strategic reserve at least in place versus being completely caught off guard, should a global economy emerge that might end up on Bitcoin, Ethereum, or whatever blockchain becomes the new alpha. Because remember, this is still very early on. We're talking about maybe a $3 trillion market cap over the next few months. This is not a lot in terms of a market that could be potentially broken into by so many major governments. I think that's the real question mark here for sure.
It's just interesting because a couple of years ago, there were fears that the government would ban Bitcoin. Remember that? And then people were like, okay, this fear is no longer relevant because now they're thinking of taxing Bitcoin transactions. But anyway, now they're talking about adopting it for a strategic reserve, which is a complete 180 from fears from a few years ago. Do you think?
Well, that's primarily on the GOP side, and we haven't heard that coming in from the Democratic side yet.
That was my next question. Suppose Harris wins. Okay, I'm not calling sides here, but suppose Harris wins. What's going to happen with Bitcoin? Do you think they'll have similar attitudes or no?
Right now, I don't know. I mean, we've been frantically trying to understand what the Harris camp is really up to when it comes to digital assets, and I think this will be a huge question. Now, there are a couple of things that would apply, and if you think about the Harris voter for a second, it's mostly younger. And it's definitely much more progressive. And a younger, more progressive individual are highly tuned in to digital assets. So at some point, you would have to cross that line, I think, as a Democratic candidate, especially with Harris's campaign, that eventually they're going to have to embrace it in one way or another. I don't think, I'm going to kind of go out on a limb, I don't think they're going to be as counter intuitive to a digital asset policy that the Biden White House was. And hear me out on this. There's a couple of reasons. You look at the construct of really the person behind controlling or at least putting a lot of pressure on the industry has come through Senator Warren. And if you look at Senator Warren and the body that exists out there, many people refer to them as the anti-crypto army, and their connection to the SEC, then you understand why the pressure has been so heavy. If you flip the script from the Democratic Party and say, we have a whole new voter bloc that is younger, more progressive, and they like and understand digital assets, this to me is a huge opportunity. Whether they take it, who knows?
Important to know, I think Kamala Harris's background is in consumer protection law. And so it's speculated that she might favor regulations that will protect the consumer, in this case, Bitcoin users. How that actually translates to regulations, I don't know. Who knows? Maybe more KYC, maybe tougher on exchanges. We'll see.
I love consumer protection laws because they keep everybody poor.
Okay. Wait a minute. You can't just drop a line like that and not expect me to follow up. What do you mean?
Listen, I think we're all
You've worked
adults.
in this field before. Yeah, you worked in tech. What does this mean?
I think we're all adults in the sense of understanding that this generation that is coming up right now, whether it's Gen Z and also the Alpha generation, to me, I see it every day. Listen, I see it every day working with young people on our team, working with a lot of youth in the communities. They understand this mainly because it's been driven into them by mostly gaming. Gaming, I would say, is the number one characteristic that they understand digital assets. And I think this is just a matter of time. They will not stand for status quo, and they definitely want to stand for something where we're seeing a deep valuation of our asset at the speed at which we're seeing it on the American dollar, when there's an alternative. And I think that's the key. And whether she wins the White House or the Democrats put someone else in there over the next several campaigns, eventually this is going to break because you are shifting now out of what has been the controlling faction of investment, technology, and society for the last 30 to 40 years, and that is the boomer population. There is only one other alternative. And I think it's as we shift into the major demos coming in, Gen Z, millennials to a certain extent, but Alpha generation, we're talking about the next 2 to 3 decades of America here. And I think this changes everything right now.
So
and we're in the right place at the right time.
Trump's speech moved the Bitcoin price up a little bit. Immediately following a speech over the weekend, the price jumped to just under $70,000.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, and now it's at 67,000. So just wiped out all the gains this morning. I don't know if this is a market-driven event or people just taking gains, or clearly whatever Trump said didn't stick over the weekend is what I'm saying. How are you reading the news?
This is normal chart activity.
Okay.
We track this stuff a lot with our own sentiment tools, and this doesn't surprise us at all with where Bitcoin is trading right now, which is around 67 at time of recording. I think the key here, there's a couple of areas that we still are a little concerned with around breaking, and that's around the 60K mark. And anybody that is following this closely, the 60K mark to me is still the one to keep an eye on. If we lose support there, that is a real problem, I think, for this particular market go around. And I think a lot of that, if it were to happen, it's probably going to be happening through some great swan or black swan event to where we see something politically or on a global stage starting to occur. So right now, it's a sensitive market. Listen, I think the S&P 500 is no different. We're starting to see a lot more sensitivity on both of these markets. This could end badly. But then again, that's the idea of risk assets. You're out there in the game to do it.
Well, what is the sentiment, either based on your own feeling or based on the people on your own show, on where Bitcoin is headed now?
Well, sentiment is still up, trending up right now. It has been for about the last 16 weeks. We've seen continued. Now, there's always down days and candles kind of coming down. But if you go back to the high and the acceleration on Bitcoin, which really happened around January, and when we saw that break out, obviously because of the ETF, January 11th, or was it January 10th? Yeah. You start accelerating, even though we saw that dip down, but you come into around the end of January and Bitcoin has been just doing nothing but up. Now, granted, it's gone sideways for several months when you look back of March to where we are right now, and even back down to our local low, which happened back here in early July. I think the opportunity still is showing upside trend for us to still see positive sentiment on Bitcoin, Ethereum, and some of the blue chips. Is still a very strong signal that this market is not complete just yet in terms of bull run.
No, I've gotten several views that should Trump win in November, Bitcoin's going to jump to $100,000. What's your response to this?
As much as I would like to think that would be the case, I'm not so much on that camp. I mainly because I think we see digital assets. They react on news. Don't get me wrong. They react on news very, probably more sensitive on news than any other asset in the market. But they also react on major flow through of something that has changed. For Bitcoin, it was an ETF. That was the major shift in policy. If you just think about policy in general, that was a major shift in policy that really put Bitcoin on a move. Now, if something like that happens, just him taking office it's going to be a nice little run for a little bit. But I think until we see real action, I don't think we see a run to 100K. Something has to be done. Either the chair of the SEC steps down. That would be a major initiative because that would pull a lot of pressure off of some of the biggest projects out there. Or we see something coming through Congress that does not end up on a veto desk, like what we saw with SAB. And SAB was not necessarily the end-all be-all, but it showed the administration's position on crypto. And that signals so much to the market right now.
So basically what you're saying is most of the change that you're expecting has already happened.
Well, no, I'm expecting two major events to occur.
Okay.
The first event that I think has to occur is a legislative shift. And I think that could happen more importantly, and this is probably more important than even Trump taking the White House. It is more important for pro-crypto, pro-blockchain to, whether it's partisan, bipartisan, or if we get into a position where we can control, when I say we, I'm talking about the blockchain industry, can control the voting block both in the House and the Senate. Then you're going to get stuff done. And I think that's the bigger opportunity. So depending on if you go to, and Coinbase does a great job with this on their Stand with Crypto site, you can go to every individual lawmaker out there, find out what their position is. And if you're not voting that way right now and you're in crypto or digital assets, I don't know what you're doing, because this is, if you're a single issue voter like me, sure, I care about a lot of things, but that's number one, because it has so much opportunity to help those who haven't made it yet. And then for those who understand what's happening really, which is kind of the early adopters. So those are that's first thing is Congress has to get in a position where they can pass the laws. Because I feel like the laws are there and in play. I mean, McHenry has done a great job in presenting. We talk to the lobby firms in DC constantly. That is a huge opportunity. The second, I think, is less regulatory efforts by the SEC and more lawmaking by Congress. Those two things happen. Now you have another, amazing opportunity for this market to explode.
Let's move on to the ETFs that you talked about. So you brought up ETH ETF. Let's talk about the ETH ETF. The ETH price did not respond well to the launch of the ETF. The easy explanation is buy the rumor, sell the news event. What's your take?
Yeah, I'm in that camp as well. I still think that Ethereum, though it's trading around 32, is still, and that was kind of where it really was, obviously we saw a little bit of run up into the ETF, but when the ETF occurred, I was anticipating that we'll probably see one of those retracements and then the opportunity for it to move beyond that. Again, ETH is one of those assets that you have to remember how Ethereum works. And if you look at the amount of Ethereum that's locked up right now, earning rewards or earning yields, the amount of Ethereum that's available in comparison to what the market could represent is quite lopsided. The question, though, is how well the offerers go to market with this in terms of how they market the product. Because we're still dealing with, I think, a big misunderstanding by asset managers of what Ethereum is. But I think by pure diversification methodologies, they'll look at diversifying their holdings and look at Ethereum as an opportunity. And that may open the eyes as people start to see Ethereum move in the coming months.
Solana ETF, another rumored ETF that's launching, widely speculated, widely anticipated. Is it going to be a widely disappointing launch? What's your take?
Well, listen, I like Solana. We invest in it. I'm still curious to what the potential for Solana truly is. And as a technology guy, I follow these blockchains very diligently and understanding where they're winning, where they're not. There's always pros and cons to every one. And I think if there is a blockchain that can at some point compete with Ethereum as a true digital asset mechanism for the open internet or the next era of Web3, which I think will happen, Solana could be right there at the gate. And for Van Eck to be able to go out and file on this, and I've talked to the Van Eck team, we've had Matthew Siegel on several times talking about this very issue. And I think they understand Solana as a critical asset in the formation of the next generation of the internet. And I think that's the more important thing, is that it is a technology that potentially could be here when we truly do see the next generation of the internet occur. And what I mean by that is, when you're thinking about internet today, it's e-commerce, SSL, basic, encryption, nothing like what we've seen in terms of blockchain. But the opportunity of digital ID ownership and also cross-trading around digital assets peer-to-peer, I think is kind of the birth of what could be, we know to be Web3, which I think is where Solana lies up as a big advantage right now, simply because the cost of transactions are just so low.
Well, the major difference between ETH and Solana is that there's a lot more Web3 applications being built on ETH and Solana than Bitcoin.
Yes.
So I'm just comparing ETH and Solana versus Bitcoin. Whereas Bitcoin could be seen as money, ETH and Solana are technologies. I'm just wondering whether or not an ETH ETF or even a Solana ETF would, I guess, impede or interfere with applications being built on Solana, just from a technology perspective, or is there no difference at all?
I don't think so. I think the innovation, remember, the blockchain itself is really what we're talking about. So innovators are building within those ecosystems, regardless of the price of ETH.
Okay.
They're building something that does something well beyond the Ethereum price or the Solana price. This is something that might be a mapping system, a deep end project, decentralized compute power. You could go on in where it's going, much less the idea of what we're going to see in terms of tokenized securities. And then you start to kind of bleed over into projects such as Avalanche with what they're doing with Onyx and JP Morgan. The opportunity here, and then you have to look at Securitize and what they've done on the Ethereum platform with BlackRock in launching BUIDL. All of these really, I think, truly tell the signs of the future. It's just a matter of time before mainstream picks this up. But listen, this is no different than 1996 when we heard about this thing called the internet. And in 2007, when the iPhone launched, and no one really saw the birth of either one of those eras. And it took us in a different place. And I think that's the same place that blockchain is now.
Okay, I want to finish on this one question. Nothing to do with blockchain, but AI is bigger than the internet in terms of its impact on our lives. I've heard this on my show. Can you evaluate this statement? True or false? What's your view?
Well, listen, I like technology as a whole in terms of a way to move society forward. The key here, of course, with AI, and I think will always be, is going to be compute power. And until we break that ceiling of compute power requirements for true AI, because remember, we're dealing with something that is, somewhat embryonic right now in terms of demand when it comes to AI, both in compute power, real use cases, and also use cases that can truly be relied upon. It's kind of funny. I was looking at, I think it was OpenAI ChatGPT the other day. And one of the statements is, what was the statement? I thought it was so funny, is results may vary or something like that. And mainly what they were talking about is in many cases because of the language model being built off of data on the internet, which to me is ironic because there's so much crap on the internet. It's not truthful, etc. And we have an AI out there learning this today. I think is a bit of a concern right now. And the real data is behind, IP. It's behind closed doors and gaining access to real medical data, real societal data, voting data, bioengineering data, all that kind of stuff. AI doesn't have real access to. So today, it's the AI of social media. And we all know how accurate social media is.
AI is here to save us from the disinformation and misinformation you see on everywhere. But no,
but it's fed by the disinformation and
yes,
and
exactly. All right. Speaking of good information, your channel has good information. Tell us about where we can learn from you.
Sure. Come over to Paul Barron Network. We talk about stuff like this right here. We talk a lot about the social economic impact of technology. Blockchain, of course, is the leading subject matter that we cover over there. We do get a lot into global and macro, mainly because we have a lot of financial analysts on, telling us about this stuff. Because we're tech guys trying to make it in a finance world is what it boils down to. But it's fun, that's for sure.
Perfect. I'll put the link down below. Make sure to follow Paul and make sure to subscribe. And Paul will speak next time. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Great to talk to you, David.
Appreciate it. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.